the story that we look at the world through. Well, first of all, the theory is that we do look at the world through a story. And, people are very, very attracted to stories, right? Children will beg for a story. So there's something very particular about stories that compel us. And it's odd if you think about it. We'll pay to go watch a story. Doesn't matter if it hurts our feelings. It doesn't matter if it makes us anxious or upsets us. Any of those things. It doesn't matter. We're still so enthralled by it that we'll go expose ourselves to it. So stories must be extremely useful to us, unless you just write that off as mere entertainment, which I don't think is very smart. And a story is about going from where you are to somewhere better, usually, and then about the catastrophes that might befall you along the way, the unexpected occurrences, and how those might resolve, and how that might change you, the way you look at the world, the way you interact with other people, either for the better or the worse. Better if it's a comedy, and worse if it's a tragedy. And so I've been trying to unpack what a story is. A simple story is just, a child might tell it. I went to kindergarten today. More complicated story is, I went to kindergarten today, but on the way, a mean dog barked at me and I got real upset and I thought maybe I'd go home, but I decided to continue. Then you pat the child on the head and say, well, that was a good decision, right? That you stuck with your course despite the fact that you got waylaid by something frightening. And so the first story is I called it a normal story in my first book, and the second story, a revolutionary story. And so Exodus in the Old Testament is a revolutionary story, right? Because the Israelites leave, the Jews leave the tyranny, Egypt, and escape into freedom, but then everything falls apart into chaos. And then, at least in principle, they find their way again and move forward. It's a very powerful story.
How can we know, because so many of these stories, whether they're from, ancient Egypt or I went to Egypt earlier this year and hearing the stories about Osiris and Isis and Horus and all of these different stories, but that or religious, even from the time that Jesus was around when they, wrote these stories down many, many decades later. How do we know if the story is real? Because memory is poor.
Well, I think that's a very, very complicated problem, obviously. Some forms of truth are factual. Scientific truths are factual. Other sorts of truths you act out and you see if they work. And so they're true in the sense that an arrow is true when it flies, or someone's heart is true, right? There's lots of variations of the idea of truth. And so Christian story posits a ideal at its center, and that's the story of Christ and everything about him. And the truth of that is to be discovered in action, as far as I can tell, and acting it out. It's a target for emulation and imitation. It's not so much a description of objective reality, although it might also be that, but and so to believe it is to act it out, a kind of ethic. And part of what Christianity is a discussion about what constitutes the ideal that we should all act out. And that unites us around that ideal. And it also structures our expectations, because we're disappointed in ourselves and in other people whenever we don't manifest that ideal. Right? Your conscience bothers you. You feel guilty. You feel ashamed because you're not putting forward your ideal self. And that ideal, people have been trying to sort out what that ideal is for a very long time.
Sure.
So certainly the Egyptians you talked about, part of their ideal was Isis, Horus, Osiris. They all represented different elements of existence. Osiris was the god of the state, essentially. He was willfully blind and was defeated by his evil brother, Seth. That happens to states all the time, that malevolent forces take them over when they're willfully blind. And Horus is the Egyptian eye. And everyone knows that symbol still, which is quite amazing given that it's thousands of years old. And Horus is the god who pays attention. So the Egyptians worshipped attention as the force that revitalized the old state. And it's brilliant. It's different than thought. Attention, right? Attention is reception. It's being willing to see what's in front of your eyes. And so the Egyptians figured out, took them a long, long time, that there was something divine about the capacity to pay attention, something that would redeem the blind state. So, all of us are inheritors of a cultural tradition. It's functional. In the US, that's embodied, I suppose, in the Constitution. But the Constitution is dead, except insofar as it's embodied in living people who are paying attention, right? So the Egyptian pharaoh was a combination of Osiris and Horus. It's a brilliant idea, hey? So that meant that he was the tradition that had founded the state, plus the capacity to pay attention and renew the state. Yeah. And they figured out that was the central idea, the central element of appropriate sovereignty.
Wow.
Right? Because you might say, well, would it be brute force? Would it be power? There's lots of accusations about that today, that cultural institutions are basically predicated on power. That's wrong. It's a terrible way to think. I mean, they are predicated on power when they become corrupt. But everyone who's corrupt uses power. No one that is behaving according to the ideal uses force to get their way. And it's not very efficient anyways. Makes you unpopular. Yeah. It makes you a target. It's unstable socially. It's unsophisticated. It doesn't even work well for children. It doesn't work well for animals, for that matter, often.
So it might not, maybe it's not even that whether the story's right or not, it's maybe more of a guideline. It's more archetypal kind of stories that help guide us. And maybe it doesn't even matter if they were real. What matters is that we're using them to be better, to have good ideals, to be better person.
Real's a tricky business in some sense, because abstract things can be more real than concrete things. Like numbers, for example, are very abstract, but they're real enough so that if you can manipulate them, you can change the world. And, if you read deep literature is, in some sense, a distillation of character, right? I mean, no one would want to read just about your day if you described every detail.
Right.
You sort of pull out what's interesting and relevant and essential. And so these stories are, in some sense, essential. And so they're true in that they're abstractions. That's how I look at it. Now, that leaves open the relationship between them and what we would normally consider historical truth. And there's a tremendous amount of debate about that. I certainly don't have the answer to that. But, there's an idea, for example, common idea that Christ is the King of Kings. Well, so you imagine that you abstract out of people what would make someone noble, right? So you look at noble features across across a assortment of different people, and you think, well, I could make a noble character out of that. And then you take all those noble characters and you take the most noble element of them and you say, that's a king. Then you take a group of kings and you say, what's most kingly? You abstract out that. Right. So that's part of the idea. Now, people like Carl Jung and C.S. Lewis believed that Christ acted out that archetype, that King of Kings. And so there was a union between the historical reality and the abstraction. And so, we don't know what would happen if an ideal person came into existence. Perhaps nothing. I mean, we don't know, do we?